So I would like to thank very much Professor Dr. Wolfgang Weisser for accepting our invitation to give a talk at the TropiBEF Workshop 2020 about one of the largest and longest running diverse experiments in the world, the Jena Experiment. Dr. Weisser obtained his PhD in 1994 from the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford. Currently, Wolfgang Weisser is a professor of the School of Life Sciences at the Technical University of Munich. His research investigates how human land use affects biodiversity and ecosystem processes and how we can use this knowledge to derive solutions for biodiversity conservation. Most of the research involves insects, species diversity, and species interactions, and studies are conducted in different systems such as grasslands, forests, and more recently, cities. Welcome, Dr. Wolfgang Weisser. The stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leo, for introducing me, and welcome to everybody. I would like to start thanking very much the organizers for inviting me, giving me the chance to speak here. I'm very impressed by this turnout, both in terms of talks and in terms of people attending. I think there's a lot of things going on in Brazil, and I particularly like that you put the biodiversity research into the next generation, so to say, by putting it, for example, into a restoration context to see how those fundamental principles that have been unraveled in experiments like the Jena experiment can actually be put into practice. I think that's really the next step, and it's absolutely timely to do so. So I've been asked to look a little bit back on my experience in conducting such experiments where I was a coordinator or involved in coordination for some time, to share some experiences that you may find useful when you conduct your project or plan a new one. So that's why this talk is called Lessons from the Jena Experiment and another project, the Biodiversity Exploratories project. So after giving some background about these experiments, I have a number of points which I would like to briefly cover about the design, the coordinator, the database, the publication policy, dealing with people, design paper, and becoming a member of an international consortium. Okay, so maybe I start with the background to give you an idea of those experiments. As Leo said, the Jena experiment, it's called Jena experiment because it's in Jena, and we didn't come up with a better name initially, and then it became the Jena experiment. So this is a classic biodiversity experiment where we look at the random loss of species. So we start off with a community of 60 species, and then we lose species 16, 8, 4, 2, 1, and basically can answer the question if a loss of species actually leads to a loss of ecosystem functioning. And here you see the plots early 2000s when they were still quite large, 20 by 20 meters. And in between you see that there are lots of other experiments. So the Jena experiment is actually not just one experiment, but a series of experiments. So this was funded by the German research unit. The question, very general, how does biodiversity affect ecosystem functioning? That's an instrument called research unit, where you can, as a group of people, apply for funding for 3 + 3 years, and then you may get another 2 years to fade out. And that's normally the end of it. So basically what we had to do, we applied in around 2000. We got funding for 3 years, then for another 3 years, then for another 2 years. Then this was the end of the research unit. And then we were allowed to start a second research unit, always having a new team. And that went from 2010 to 2018. Then there was a little break with no funding. And since this year, there is now a new research unit that's led by Nico Eisenhower. There were always between 8 and 12 sub-projects, so 1, 2, 3 PIs sharing a PhD student and 1 or 2 postdocs. It changes between the phases, but that was basically the setup. And Michael Scherer-Lorenzen was also involved quite a bit in this experiment. So this is an experiment where we have to maintain our species community. So first of all, we maintain it as a hay meadow. We have a team of gardeners who have to mow the field twice per year, and then the biomass is taken away. And then, of course, the most tedious task is we have to weed the plots. So there's a lot of effort of people maintaining the field site by taking out species that should not be there. And PhD students also have the chance to be involved in this. The Jena experiment has been long running and has always had a number of good people. So there's this from Nico Eisenhower's review the last time has a number of papers that are being cited. So you could say that that overall it actually has worked quite well. And I think one of the reasons it has worked quite well is that it was a whole community of people who worked together quite smoothly. And this is something I consider to be extremely important. So and if you want to read a bit more about the experiments, there's several reviews. One of the reviews is this one that you can get for free at Basic and Applied Ecology. Now, the second project is the so-called Biodiversity Exploratory Project, where I've also been involved in from the beginning. This question is more general. How does land use affect biodiversity and ecosystem functioning? Where we wanted to go to the real world and see how in real ecosystems, rather than in a model ecosystem as in the Jena experiment, biodiversity affects functioning and how does land use affect biodiversity. This is a slightly different funding scheme by the German Science Foundation, its so-called priority program. Basically, a group of scientists can apply for such a priority program, and if it's approved, then there is a call. So it's a funding of 3 + 3 years. And in our case, there's a formal renewal, a review every 6 years. So it's in contrast to the research unit where you select your partners. This is an open call. So every 3 years, everybody in Germany can apply, and always between 80 and 90 people apply with a project to work there. And between 35 and 45 projects are funded, which means that every 3 years we have quite a turnover of projects working there. So the idea is to look at the effect of land use on biodiversity in our landscapes, which we call cultural landscapes because they are strongly affected by years and years of land use. So we decided to focus on the one hand, forest, and on the other hand, grasslands. We did not include cropping areas. So the idea was that we have both in the grassland and the forest a land use intensity gradient, which in the grassland ranges from pastures, mown pastures, so that are both grazed and mown, and meadows that are only mown, that are either unfertilized and grazed, or so very just with a little bit, maybe many sheep, but only for a day, to grassland that are fertilized and can be mown up to 4 or 5 times. So it's not extremely intensive, but quite intensive. Okay, some impressions. We actually have very, very few plots with horses. Most are with cows and sheep. And the management of the grassland, as I said, is you have large grassland that are regularly mown 1 to 4 times. In the forest, we also have a land use gradient, and in a large proportion of Germany, the natural forest would be a beech forest. And of those beech forests, some of them we call unmanaged forest because they're in some sort of reserve. So actually, it's not really unmanaged because there has been some management in the past, but maybe not in the last 20, 30 years. There is no forest in Germany that is really unmanaged, or basically no forest. And then the other extreme is where beech has been replaced by conifer spruce or pine. So you have a spruce or pine forest, and then you have a more standard beech forestry, age-class forest, basically where you have cohorts of trees that are theoretically cut at the same time. So again, there's a land use gradient. And we've selected 3 regions in Germany, in the northeast, in the center, and in the southwest, where in each we have 50 grassland plots and 50 forest plots, so a total of 300 plots. The project is very attractive to people. You have seen that the funding rate is about 50% for those who apply, which is larger than you have in a normal German Science Foundation application. So many people take part, and overall we have up to now more than 400 people who have participated for 3 years or for longer time, that are distributed all over Germany. So all these people theoretically work on all the 300 plots, even though individual people may only work on a subset of plots. And because we have so many people taking part, we are able to cover diversity quite comprehensively, both below ground and above ground, and going from microbes using quite a number of different molecular techniques, metabarcoding, to higher taxa. And we also try to look at a number of ecosystem functions, processes, productivity, and also some proxies for ecosystem services. So because these plots are set in the real world, and the plots belong to somebody, and the owners actually manage the plots, we are only allowed to do some research there. And this means we have to always deal with all the stakeholders that are involved, either because they are landowners or because they give us permissions to work there, drive on the forest streets, and so on. And in order to facilitate this, so basically this is the only thing you can see on a grassland, which is our little fence with some meteorological equipment. In order to facilitate this interaction between landowners and scientists, we have so-called local management teams in each of the 3 regions, 5 people who are responsible for maintaining the plots, negotiating the visits with the landowners, but also doing some maintenance work and helping people to take some samples. This project has also been successful, again, mainly because so many people worked together and contributed their data so that we could have unique data sets that, that is impossible to assemble when you're on your own. Okay, so after having worked in there for, I don't know, 15 years, a bit longer, and what are sort of my take-home messages which I would like to share? So the first take-home message is that it's important that in the beginning you spend sufficient time to think about your design. Some of you may remember that before the Jena experiment started in 2002, there were publications by Dave Tillman and by Andy Hector, and there was a lot of controversy about the statistical design. One of the problems was that the most diverse mixtures basically included all plants in the experiment, and this means that if you have 1 or 2 very dominant plants, then they are more likely to stay in to also be in the diverse mixtures and basically dominate what happens. And this, for example, was the case for red clover in the Andy Hector experiment, biodepth. Actually, Michael Scherlons was part of this experiment. So this is something that people criticized a lot, even though it turned out that wasn't such a big problem. But in any case, when we started the experiment, we basically showed our design to many people, including very critical people, and got their feedback in order to make sure that the design was sound. So in the end, we had quite a boring experiment, but we never ever in all these years had anybody complaining about our experimental design. It was not the most advanced design, but I think that's an advice. Make sure that you go to your critics first and make sure that your design is sound, because you will never ever be able to correct it if you've done a mistake in the beginning. Okay, so then when you have your design, you start your work, and then there will be one person whom I call the coordinator, who is not necessarily the scientist who runs the show, or the speaker as we call it in Germany, but it's a postdoc. It's a postdoc who is extremely important. It's a postdoc who has a number of very important skills. She or he understands the design. She knows what is important for the experiment, probably knows the plants if you employ a botanist, which is always quite smart, at least in the beginning. The person is responsible for maintaining the field site. He or she has to be a good supervisor of the field team, has to facilitate research. So like when somebody comes and, oh, I want to take a soil core, where can I take a soil core? Then the coordinator will be the person to tell them where to put it. So it will really be a lot of day-to-day decisions on how the research is conducted. So the person needs to take decisions fast. Yeah, you don't want somebody who is hesitating for weeks and weeks, but on the other hand, you would like to have somebody who knows when to ask somebody and when not to ask somebody. Yeah, so choosing such a person is a very important task. It's almost as important as having a good design. But then, of course, when you look for such a person, you have to also make this position very attractive, because a lot of the work is altruistic. So it's management work rather than data analysis or paper writing. So the question, what is the incentive to the coordinator, rather than to wait for a few years and then become a so-called synthesis postdoc that takes all the data and writes a nice nature paper or so. So how do you make the coordinator being a happy person? So I think there are several approaches. What we have done always is that we consider management to be an intellectual work. So just by managing the field type, you could be a co-author. So in the exploratories, for example, everybody who published a paper with the design has to make the coordinator a co-author, at least for the first paper, and the same for the Jena experiment. Then we always made sure that the coordinator becomes the data owner, I come to data owner later, of some important data. For example, the plant biomass or plant species composition. So that's a variable that many people want as a covariate. So by this, the coordinator also becomes, gets some rights to be a co-author if she or he wants to. And then there will always be moments in time when your field team is not so busy. Yeah, of course, you will only have a team that's not too large, but still there is some time when they have some free spare time, and then the coordinator is allowed to let them collect data for their own research question. This allows the coordinator to also get their own work done. And our coordinators like Christiane Roscher and Alexandra Weigel, if you look at what they published, you will see they actually did very well in becoming a coordinator. So I think it can be an extremely attractive position. So the next is have a professional database. So this actually links to the question of data sharing. And working together means that you can also publish with 2 or more groups. And that's the main opportunity in a research group, so that you can actually share data and get insights that you couldn't get yourself. So the data sharing is an important part of such a research unit. And the data quality is also very important, because you don't want to work on some preliminary data. You want, if you take variables of another person as a covariate or as a dependent variable or independent variable, you want that these data are in a very good state. So data sharing has to be organized in an efficient way. And also funders and journals would now require the data to become public. So you need to anyway make your data become public at some stage. In the Jena experiment, we have learned it the hard way. We start with a collection of Excel sheets, but this becomes very unsatisfactory for many, many reasons. Nobody remembers exactly what there is. Yeah, you have 150 copies of the biomass data because they're used in the covariate and in every Excel sheet. So it's not very good. On the other hand, if you find somebody who makes you a purpose-made database, my experience is this is a lot of work and possibly not sustainable, because when this person then drops out, there's a database that only one person in the world can understand. And I've seen this happening quite a bit. So my experience is that it's best to associate with an existing database project, which has already experience in a professional metadata scheme and so on. So I think it's worth investing into this by collaborating with people who can do this if you don't have the like a database project in your own project. And I think in many countries there are now more and more initiatives of people setting up such a service that you can exploit. And this is more difficult than it looks, because the data have to have various metadata. And that's something you have to think about in advance when you start collecting these data. There are different types of data, in our case here, plot related or field related. And if you go to the countryside, there's many other data. So you have to have a database that is capable of handling all of this data. And you have to have people who know what you have to think about when you invent your metadata template. And you also want to have something like a rights management, so that people who put data in the database, and I will come to this in a second, are sure that those data are then not completely free to use by everybody. Yeah, so you want a database where it is very clear what person can access the metadata and what person can access the primary data. Yeah, and this is quite a sophisticated exercise, and something, in my view, you cannot do on the side, and you cannot do in an access database without having at least one full-time person or two doing this. So I think it's always better to go to somewhere where you get this service. And you can then also help to develop those databases further. So this is like the Jena Experiment database. We were very proud that we have the shopping cart symbol. Basically, that means when you browse through the database, then and you have to download, I don't know, 50 variables because you want to do some meta-analysis, then you don't have to download 50 data sets individually, but you can put them in your shopping cart like in Amazon, and then at the end you can get it all together. This is just a little thing which seems obvious, but took, I don't know, 3 years until it was programmed. So if you have something like this in your database already, that's very good. Okay, so then you have a database, but then you have to make people put the data into the database. And this means that you have to think of a publication policy from the beginning of your project. And this is a challenge that you don't much read about in papers on databases, because the people who make databases, for them it's sort of useful or obvious that people would like to share their data. And also, yeah, the funders find it obvious that you want to share your data. But if you look from the point of the scientist, it's actually not so obvious, because people do not like to do extra work. And it's extra work putting data into the database. So actually, people need some incentive to contribute to the database. Yeah, otherwise, they will not do it. In my view, you cannot really force people to put the data into the database in a way that other people can use it if they do it against their own will. People also do not like other people to use their data. Yeah, because if you see somebody else analyzing your data, you think, maybe I should have had this idea myself. I probably would have had this idea myself. So you like to hold your data back, even if you never have this idea, but you don't want to sacrifice this possibility by making your data available. So that means in order to prevent this holding back of data, you have to have a clear role of how data owners can influence what happens with their data. So that at least the policy that we have had in the Jena experiment and also in the exploratories. And most importantly, people have very different opinions on what constitutes a contribution that warrants co-authorship. So if you ask 10, there are guidelines, but still, if you ask 10 different people, you get 10 different answers. And unfortunately, many of them are quite asymmetric. So while they consider their own contribution to be extremely useful, they could normally consider the contribution of others maybe less useful. So conflicts about this are always possible. And this is why I think you need some clear rules from the beginning in order to try to avoid this as much as possible. Because everybody benefits from data sharing. And when people experience this, like becoming a co-author on a big paper that would not have been possible without sharing, they're more likely to share themselves. So I think as the people leading an experiment, I think it's important that you have some shared papers in the beginning so that people see the advantage of sharing data, and that you then enforce that all the data go through the database before they give to somebody else. But I have to say, it's a constant battle to find fair solutions. This is a problem that will always occur, and no policy can avoid having such conflicts. And we have a publication policy, which actually many people consider to be too protective for data owners. But I do think that one of the reasons that we have so many data, and I will show this in a minute, is that data owners really thought it's useful to put the data in there. So there's some preamble that it's useful. And then there is basically something saying that people who planned an experiment, collected data, were involved in the analysis should be credited in the form they consider appropriate. So there has to be some negotiation process between the person using the data and the person giving the data. And of course, you don't always have to be co-authored, could also be mentioning in the acknowledgements. And you can read this later when you have the presentation. What we found very useful is that the people who collected the data, they should be contacted about the use of the data prior to any analysis. Yeah, so people can browse the database and see the metadata, but at the moment when they want to use the data of somebody else, then there is a so-called data request function where you can say, I would like to have your data for this and this purpose, and then the data owner can actually agree on this, or you can have a telephone call and talk about the modalities. But then this data request function also basically documents who has received what data and for what purpose. Now, if you're only 3 people, that's maybe not possible. But if you're a larger project that grows and then you have people leaving and people coming, such a thing is extremely useful. So that's one thing we introduced. The second is that we have what we call a so-called paper proposal. So whenever you like to publish a paper, you basically announce it to everybody so that people are aware of what happens. So this paper proposal informs people when you intend to write a paper. In the exploratories, we have a so-called synthesis proposal, and not for every paper, but if you have data, if you use data for 3 or more groups, then you have to write a synthesis proposal where you basically give the rationale, the hypothesis, the data you want to use, methods of analysis, maybe some hypothetical or preliminary graph. And everybody in the whole unit can then contribute and can maybe decide to join. And this also has to become very useful, because it takes away some tension, because people think, oh, I didn't know, I would have contributed had I known. But what we also learned is that you also need a sell-by date. Yeah, because otherwise you get a paper proposal by somebody having a relatively vague idea, and then basically they don't do anything with it anymore. But they also can always say, oh, listen, this was my idea. Have a look at the paper proposal. So the paper proposal is a solution to all of this. And honestly, I have to say that we still have proposals that are not specific enough. They say, oh, I would like to use all diversity and all functions and all trait data to work on a particular question, which of course people then will not do. So this is a constant reminder to ourselves that we have to be a little bit more specific so that new people also have some space left that they can explore scientifically. So the Jena Experiment database actually has a lot of data. So that was like 2 years ago, 87,000 variables that were collected in 80 plots each. So it's a lot of data. A certain fraction of it is already publicly available, but it's all documented and people could theoretically use this. And if you would like to use the Jena Experiment data, you can write there and make some suggestions. And also in the exploratories, there is a lot of data sharing between the groups that we regularly document. Okay, the sixth point is to keep people on board. And this is also something that you may find a bit funny, but you will discover that people actually differ a lot, and you're not anymore working just with friends. Like when I was a postdoc, I was working with friends, and if somebody wasn't so nice, I wouldn't work with them. Now, you cannot do this if you are in a large project. So you have to get along. And people also have different skills that are important for the experiment. Some are very smart, and that you need them just to get some ideas, give the right idea for the analysis. Others, for example, are not afraid of a lot of work. So if you do a big campaign, these people can do it, and those are not necessarily the same people. So maybe somebody knows a special technique that's useful for everybody. And all of them are probably nice, but all of them are also difficult. So I think keeping the group together, how to deal, that is, I think, it's not an easy task. And I think finding a way of dealing with each other in a way that people contribute constantly and working together, I think that's a challenge. And if you manage to do this, I think you have achieved a lot, and that pays off in many publications and a lot of insight that you generate. You can also deal some committees for conflict. So we always had a publication board because there were always publication conflicts that made some suggestion of how you can sort out a particular conflict when somebody didn't want to contribute data, but they are needed, or when somebody felt not appropriately credited. Yeah, so those conflicts will arise, and you just have to find a way of solving it. And the more you think about it in advance, the less surprised you are. And this can actually destroy a project if you have, in the end, two groups within the group that don't talk to each other anymore. Okay, then publish a design paper. We did publish design papers on both the Jena Experiment and the biodiversity exploratories, and this is in our good old German journal of the German Ecological Society. They're cited quite well because they're of course cited by all the papers that are coming out of these experiments, but they're also cited by other people to refer to the experiment. So it's very useful. It also saves you writing a lot of material methods section and so on. And you don't need to publish this in an extremely high-ranked journal. Take your local journal and publish your design there. And then it's good for the journal because it will attract a lot of publication, and also it's very good for your citations. The BEF China, as you will see, they published in Methods in Ecology and Evolution. So this is of course a big achievement, but as I said, you can also publish in other journals. It doesn't really matter which journal you publish it in. Okay, and then my final insight would be that I think it's very useful nowadays to, from the beginning, think about how you can be a contributing member of international consortium. Because if you read these multidisciplinary journals, you see more and more that worldwide studies are used to answer general questions. So even if your experiment is wonderful in its way in tackling a particular question, it still is only one experiment. So joining up with others in a network brings some benefit that allows you to look at questions in a more general way. For example, you can look at the results across a gradient of temperature or latitude, and this will make it much more general than if it only comes out from your experiment. And there are already a number of existing experiments like the TreeDiffNet or NutNet and others, and there are more and more networks coming up. And I think it is important that you from the beginning try to become a member of this, a contributing member. Maybe you need to add a treatment to become part of the network, like adding a nutrient treatment to become part of NutNet, for example. So I think it's worth, when you think about your design, to also consider this possibility that in a few years' time, you also contribute valuable data. You can also learn from and contribute to this international network of scientists. So it's very illuminating if you take part. And you can take part in those joint synthesis efforts or even lead them. And for the Jena experiment, it was also the case that many of the high-ranked papers, the Jena experiment data are actually only a small set of the total data. And but there was always a co-author from this. So, for example, you see Alexandra Weigelt, who basically contributed the data to this joint analysis. Okay, and with this, I would like to conclude. Working together in a larger experiment is a lot of fun. It's very good for your career. It's already a little bit unfair that a person who does the PhD on her own or in his own actually has a disadvantage compared to those who work in the big experiment, because those become a co-author in many papers. But this is the trend there is. And as I said, you can do things that you couldn't possibly do on your own. So it's extremely useful for science and also for you yourself. Many of the challenges of working in such a group can be anticipated, and they need to be addressed early on. So I think that's very important that you think of the potential problems and think about a solution early on and not just when they have happened. And I think there's no need to invent all solutions from scratch, like the database. Consult with various others with experience to find your best solution. And you will hear some other experiments today, like BEF China, or the project that Michael Scherer-Lorenzen led. So I think there's a lot of people worldwide whom you can consult and who can help you to find a good solution, so that you have maybe less problems than they have had early in the experiment. Okay, with this, I would like to thank you all for listening, and this is the end. Thank you.